At Rosetta, I found that the commander, Bidon Julien, knew no more about the army than Admiral Brie did. "I am, however, easy," he said to me. "The inhabitants are perplexed, and that is a sure sign that we are victorious. You have nothing to fear on the Nile. I shall give you an armed vessel to carry you to Cairo, of which place the army must by this time have taken possession." The day after I embarked on the Nile, I met Arrighi, now Duke of Padua, who had come from Cairo and was conveying to the admiral an account of our victories, with the reiterated order to go to Corfu. When I told the general-in-chief that the fleet was still at Aboukir, he showed signs of great ill humor, and fearing that Arrighi might encounter difficulties in his way and not join the admiral quick enough, he sent off that very night his aide-de-camp, Julien, with fresh orders. The unfortunate youth went down the Nile in a digerme, escorted by a dozen soldiers. His want of experience was the cause of his death. Having entered the branch of Alexandria, he thought he might rest for the night, but the Arabs murdered him and his escort. In him, General Bonaparte lost one of the best officers of his staff, and I, a most excellent friend. The English were above a fortnight without showing themselves, and Arrighi found the admiral, who was convinced that they had counted the number of his ships and did not dare to engage. It was not until the 1st of August that Nelson appeared off Alexandria with 14 ships of the line and several frigates. The particulars of the battle, at which, however, I was not present, are too well known to require my repeating here. Although but a few days had elapsed since the arrival of the general-in-chief in Cairo, he had been preceded, as he was everywhere else, by such strict orders and excellent administration, that the soldiers, and in general all the French, were accustomed to walk through the metropolis and its environs without feeling the slightest uneasiness. The city of Cairo presented a curious spectacle to the Europeans who saw it for the first time. I had landed at Boulak on the Nile, at a great distance from the square of El Bekir, where General Bonaparte lived. The narrow streets of the city were filled with camels fastened to one another in long rows, carrying all sorts of goods on their backs and led by a single man. The inhabitants passed through the small vacant spaces with slow gravity and with their pipes in their mouths, while our soldiers, mounted on donkeys, galloped cheerfully, sliding between the camels and bursting into roars of laughter. A shocking dust and an offensive smell of mummies suffocated us. Here and there, a few grave Mussulmans, seated on their mules, opened themselves a passage by the aid of their stick-bearers, who struck all that opposed them, and even the men who did not rise at their approach. Beggars, carefully hiding their faces and little inclined to discover what ours show, pestered the passers-by with singular cries and seemed to be soliciting alms with angry imprecations. Murad Bey, after the Battle of the Pyramids, had sought refuge in Upper Egypt. He had still with him several thousand Mamelukes. His influence over people was considerable, and as it might prove dangerous, the general-in-chief, while he was preparing against him the expedition entrusted to Desaix, tried to gain him over by secret negotiations. His legitimate wife and his whole harem remained at Cairo. Bonaparte sent Eugène Beauharnais to the wife with his compliments and the assurance that she had nothing to fear. She received Eugène politely, and in return for the presents the general-in-chief had sent her, she gave him her husband's beautiful shawl and some of his arms. But the respect shown to the wife of Murad Bey had no effect on that chief. The vigor and talent of General Desaix and the courage of our troops, who more than once forced him to retire to the oasis, and reduced his followers to a few faithful friends, could not persuade that intrepid leader to lend an ear to any arrangement whatever. And it was not until after 2 years' conflict and adversity that he had at last consented to come to an understanding with the head of the French army. But at that time, General Bonaparte had already left Egypt. It had been supposed that in so fruitful a country, all the wealth of the East would be accumulated. Instead of that, we found misery everywhere. The government of the Mamelukes was devoid of either common sense or moderation. Besides the miri and another tax which the people of Egypt were obliged to pay to the Grand Seigneur, they were loaded with imposts, which the caprice and tyranny of the subordinate officers were perpetually inventing. The Beys, who were the chiefs of the Mamelukes, the officers quartered in the different provinces, and even the private horsemen who were sent to maintain order in the villages, thought themselves entitled to impose and levy taxes more or less heavy. The fellah, or peasant, groaned under the load of these numerous exactions, and if he was unfortunate enough to have children of either sex that drew the attention of the leaders, they were taken away from him to satisfy their brutal lust. One of the first measures of the general-in-chief was to set the people secure in regard to their property, to make them comprehend the plain and judicious system of taxation about to be established, and to acquaint them that for the arbitrary laws to which they were subject under the Mamelukes would be substituted in each province divans composed of the most reputable men to judge their disputes. These various declarations soon dissipated alarm, and we had, in fact, no cause to complain of the people during the first 6 months of our stay in the country. The Arab tribes were still, however, very dangerous. We had succeeded in making peace with some of them, but others more numerous and better armed continued frequently to interrupt our communications and plunder our convoys by land as well as on the Nile. We were in consequence obliged to organize a system of pursuit, which was followed up with so much energy that the tribes felt at last convinced that they must either submit or retire to other deserts. Murad Bey, who was now in Upper Egypt, gave us no more cause of uneasiness. But Ibrahim Bey, next to Murad, was most powerful leader of the Mamelukes, had gone forward to meet the caravan returning from Mecca, and under the pretense of defending it against the French army, he stopped in its way and plundered it. He afterwards returned to Egypt by way of the Salahiyah, and proclaimed his intention of attacking the French army from that side. General Renier, whom I accompanied on that short expedition, had not much trouble with the Arabs and Mamelukes of the vanguard, but he was conscious that his small division would soon be destroyed if no one came to his assistance. I went to acquaint the general-in-chief with this circumstance, who immediately flew to help him at the head of some regiments of cavalry which he had succeeded in mounting with the horses he found in Lower Egypt. The Mamelukes were beaten at Salahiyeh, from which place the battle took its name. It was then that the general-in-chief learned the disaster of our fleet at Abu Qir. The news was brought to him by an aide-de-camp of General Kleber. The officer's horse being unable to go any further, he had written some particulars in an open letter, which I found in the hands of a peasant to whom he had entrusted it. I read the letter, and advancing towards the general-in-chief, I begged him to withdraw for a moment from the group of staff officers which surrounded him. I then gave him the note. When he had read it, he said to me, "You know its contents. Keep the secret." We returned to Belbez, where we found breakfast on the table. Everybody was in good spirits, and particularly the troops, who had retaken from the Mamelukes the spoil of the caravan. They were going to sell the goods for almost nothing, but the general-in-chief forbade the officers to buy any of them there, and ordered the soldiers to dispose of them on their return to Cairo. All of a sudden, while breakfasting, the general-in-chief said to his guests, It seems you like this country. That is very lucky, for we have now no fleet to carry us back to Europe. He then acquainted them with the particulars of the Battle of Aboukir, and they were listened to with as much earnestness as the general had related them. Everyone soon appeared reconciled to the event, and nobody talked any more of it. Ibrahim Bey had retired to Syria, and there was no doubt that he would organize in that country considerable bodies of irregular troops which would disturb our frontiers. The general-in-chief had also learned that the news of the invasion of Egypt had been received with great displeasure at Constantinople. The English, enraged at the conquest of Malta, and sensible of the important consequences of the occupation of Egypt to their establishments in India, pressed the Turks to go to war. The general-in-chief had therefore reason to expect that he would not only be continually harassed by Ibrahim Bey, but also that the English would make themselves masters of the ports of Syria. He took a resolution to be beforehand with them, but it was first of all necessary to know what might be the dispositions of the Pasha, who commanded all Syria. The name of the Pasha, for the time being, was Djezar, a man of very energetic character who had maintained himself for several years in his post in spite of the Sultan himself, and who enforced obedience by the terror his cruelties inspired. The general-in-chief sent to him a young Frenchman just come home from Mascata with the consul Beauchamp, and who was very well acquainted with the Arabic language. Djezar sent an ambiguous answer which served to convince General Bonaparte that it would be necessary to support his declarations with an army. But a fatal incident occurred which threatened the expedition with an indefinite delay, while perfect tranquility seemed to prevail in Cairo and its outskirts. A rebellion without any apparent cause suddenly broke out at one of the gates of the city. A number of wounded who had been at the Battle of Salahieh and some invalids of the division of Régnier, filling about 20 transports, were murdered, and the rebellion quickly spread throughout the city like wildfire. General Dupuy, commander of the fortress, immediately mounted his horse with all the men he could bring together, but he was assassinated with several of his companions. To oppose the rebels any longer in the streets was not to be thought of. Means were, however, found to restrain them, though they had made themselves masters of one of the largest mosques in town. It was then resolved to fire on them from the citadel. The bombs and howitzers made great havoc among them, after which some battalions of infantry attacked the mosque, where all the rest were killed or taken prisoners. This rebellion lasted 3 days and did not occasion any great loss to the army, but the general-in-chief lost one of his best aides-de-camp. Colonel Sukovsky had already been wounded at Alexandria and also at the Battle of Salahieh, and was not yet completely recovered when the general-in-chief, wishing to send some officer to reconnoiter out of the city, he offered himself, pretending that it was his turn to march and that his wound was entirely healed. Accompanied by 15 guides, he was crossing that part of the desert that separates the town of Cairo from the citadel, when a troop of Arabs that had concealed themselves behind a number of small hillocks suddenly rushed upon him. He was killed with the greatest part of his escort, for only 2 men returned to Cairo, where they brought the fatal tidings. I was not then in Cairo. By order of the general-in-chief, I was accompanying General Andreozzi on an expedition to the Lake Mensal and Pelouse. We were completely ignorant of what was going forward in the capital, and I was sailing leisurely up the Nile when I learned that at Mansoura, or La Mansour, the hospital containing our sick and wounded with a detachment of soldiers, had been surprised and all the men butchered without mercy. the rebellion of Cairo had reached the two banks of the river, and more particularly the branch of the Damietta. Some revolted villages were burned to make an example. The general-in-chief was very desirous to know whether the inhabitants of Mansoura had retained any remembrance of their victorious resistance, when under the reign of St. Louis they had been so imprudently attacked by the Count d'Artois. But it appeared from all inquiries that these Egyptians were acquainted neither with the name of St. Louis nor with the gallant actions that had illustrated their ancestors. In the month of December 1798, the general-in-chief had not yet received any accounts from the Directory. The political object of the expedition had experienced great impediments by the loss of the fleet. It was no longer to be hoped we should ever be able to lead the army to India, the superiority of the English being now concentrated on the sea. All that remained, therefore, to be done was to profit by our situation, to bring back the Turks to their old sentiments of friendship for the French, and detach them from the English, or at least to prevent the two emperors of Austria and Russia from concerting with each other the total dismembering of the Ottoman Empire. The general-in-chief thought himself authorized to suppose that Monsieur de Talleyrand, who had been appointed French ambassador in Constantinople, had really departed for that metropolis and had succeeded in maintaining his post there. In those circumstances, it was important to correspond with him, and the best way appeared to be to send Monsieur Beauchamp to Constantinople, but it was necessary for him to escape the watchful eyes of the English cruisers. General Bonaparte contrived for that purpose the following plan. The Turkish caravella, which had come over to bring the Sultan the yearly tribute from Egypt, was then riding at anchor in the port of Alexandria. The captain of that vessel was a man respected in his own country, and he had with him his two sons. He received an order to carry Monsieur Beauchamp to Constantinople and to leave one of his sons in Alexandria as a hostage for the safe return of that gentleman to Egypt. The ostensible commission of the consul was to require the release of all the Frenchmen who were detained in Syria, whether merchants or consular agents, and also of such military as had been made prisoners either in coming to Egypt or in returning to France. He was in the course of his negotiation with the Grand Vizier to insinuate that France would abandon Egypt and make a treaty of friendship with Turkey if the latter consented to give up all her connections with England, in which case the French troops would join those of the Sultan, either to put an end to the war with the two emperors by one common treaty, or to give him support if peace should not take place. Unfortunately, Monsieur Beauchamp was discovered by the English and sent to the Seven Towers at Constantinople. It was about this time that the plague began its ravages at Alexandria. I was ordered to accompany Monsieur Beauchamp to that place, and I might superintend the preparations for his departure and make a report to the General-Chief on the state of the fortifications there. When I arrived, I found General Marmont commanding the province and the whole seashore as far as Rosetta. "You arrive at an unfortunate moment," he said. "The plague has broken out yesterday among our troops. It appears that the order given on our arrival at Alexandria to burn the clothes of the persons who had died of the contagion has been negligently executed. Some of the inhabitants have warned them again, and our troops being in close connection with them, the contact has spread the plague among the French, and I have been assured that it cannot fail soon to break out also among the Turks. Yesterday, 4 Frenchmen died. There are 8 sick today, who will probably be numbered with the dead tomorrow." All possible precautions had already been taken by General Marmont. The troops were lodged under tents, and all communication betwixt them and the inhabitants was prohibited. The most rigorous orders had also been issued forbidding the battalion to which the sick belonged to hold any connection with the others, but the carelessness of the soldiers destroyed all the good effects of these measures. They looked upon the plague as an enemy it was their duty to challenge, and the communication of the soldiers with each other continued notwithstanding the severest discipline. My orders were to order Commissary Michaud from Rosetta to Alexandria. He came with a suite of 10 persons and lodged with us at General Marmont's. In the space of 2 days, he was the only survivor of all those he had brought with him. One of his secretaries, named Renaud, left the hotel to go and sign some orders at the lodgings of his master had taken place in the city. The paper on which he wrote sufficed to communicate the disease to his blood. The next morning he sent word that he was not very well and could not breakfast at the general's table. We went immediately to see him. He was still up, but his features already bore all the marks of the fatal malady. His eye glared, his tongue faltered. He had a profuse cold perspiration and pains in his limbs. The physician who was called to visit him just appeared at the door of his room with a thick, long stick in his hand. After having looked at him for a moment, he ordered hot water to be placed before him and retired without administering any other remedy. The unfortunate young man begged us to get him ink and paper that he might write to his family. In the afternoon, he expired in great agony, so that his illness did not last above 15 hours.